it's easy for us, and I sometimes think we're purposely misled into thinking that this is an issue of President Bush or Vice President Cheney, or that it's essentially an ideological war. Although those individuals do bear a responsibility and there are ideological aspects to this conflict, it's driven largely by profit issues for a very small but very focused and powerful group of military concerns, particularly industries. And this is well covered. There's a recent article by Richard Cummings, and he shows very clearly how much the profit issue is determining policy. In this respect, I would say that the analogy that leaps out for me is not Vietnam. There are, of course, parallels to Vietnam, but for a large-scale war, sort of a war without end like this, the real analogy is what happened with Japan in its incursions into Manchuria in the 1930s. In that case, you had corporate interests who had invested very heavily in Manchuria, who were in collusion with military interests, and they drove the war. In Japan in the late 30s, there was a very large number of bureaucrats within the government, even conservative bureaucrats, people within the military, who came to feel that this was a mistake. It was a serious mistake. And they still could not stop it. They couldn't stop it because the Kwantung Army and these other military interests were no longer fully under the control of Tokyo. The privatization system is most dangerous in the military, but it's of course been enacted across the board in the United States and the federal government. James Carroll's book, The House of War, explains, I think, very well what the structural elements were within the defense system which have generated essentially this expansionist tendency, which was kept in check by other sort of aspects of American society until the last, say, 7 or 8 years. What changed? The fundamental problem came after the Korean War. The United States had always, after a military conflict, reverted to a peacetime economy. But after the Korean War, it failed to do that. And essentially, it was an economy which was largely dependent on military expenditures. I wouldn't say the entire economy was, but large chunks of it were dependent upon military expenditures. That system worked very well. It generated wealth, it generated investment in technologies, and it drove our economy. What we see today is that that monster, which had helped to pull our economy forth, is now returning essentially to devour us.
The armed forces of the United States are engaged in a struggle that will determine the direction of the global war on terror and our safety here at home. The new strategy I outlined tonight will change America's course in Iraq.
A large part of the problem comes actually from the ruling class within the United States. And I don't say that in the sense that I'm hostile to the ruling class, since many of my friends, I think, classify as ruling class. But rather that there was in the United States, for all its flaws, there was a sense in, say, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, in which people who were, say, from moneyed families, felt a certain obligation, a certain sense of responsibility. And you had people like Eisenhower or Marshall, say, within the military, who I don't think you would call them liberals, but they had a very strong sense of responsibility. And particularly in the case, say, Eisenhower, of course, who coined the term military-industrial complex. It's much harder to find individuals like that. In fact, there's a book by Frank Schaeffer in which he outlines essentially the way in which the elite, the people who are lucky enough to get good educations and have families who could take care of them in their careers, have essentially pulled out from government service, from military service, and from issues of foreign policy. I like to avoid personalities. The change from Rumsfeld to Gates is a perfect example of that. The people thought that somehow it was Rumsfeld, it was his personality, or that it's Cheney for that matter. And therefore, if you change that person, that evil man, you would have a change in policy. And I think in the case of Gates, it didn't have the impact that some people had hoped it would have. Particularly important, I think, for us to understand, and this is the part where I think many citizens don't really get it, is that within corporations or within the government, people are essentially playing by a different set of rules. Their own interests of their own particular group, because going into Iraq or increasing troops, it doesn't really benefit any of us immediately. It doesn't benefit the economy, doesn't benefit the military, in fact, doesn't benefit many people in the government. But there are small focus groups who benefit immensely. So the question is, if you were going to benefit immensely from something, so much that it would be worth, say, billions of dollars to you, would you be willing to do something which would be essentially suicidal for the nation as a whole? If you have a healthy sort of public discourse in civil society, then that will not happen because there will be counter forces. If you don't have a healthy sort of environment, then it in fact can happen because the other elite groups which would normally squash that tendency are out to lunch.